On December 10, 2020, Brandon Bernard lay strapped to a gurney at the Federal Correctional Center in Terre Haute, Indiana. An IV line connected to his arm carried the chemicals that would end his life. A pale green death chamber surrounded him. Glass barriers separated him from the witnesses. At 9:27 p.m., after delays caused by last-minute appeals, the pentobarbital stopped his heart. He lifted his head. He turned toward the windows where the family of his victims sat watching. He spoke for more than 3 minutes. His voice was steady and clear. His breathing became shallow, his eyes closed. He did not twitch or convulse. He appeared peaceful. Then he was gone. He was 40 years old. He had spent 20 years and 6 months on death row. He was the youngest person executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years, based on his age at the time of his crime. He was the 9th federal inmate executed in 2020, and the first person executed during a presidential transition period in 130 years. His final meal? A meat lover's pizza and a brownie. His final words? "I'm sorry. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't." That's the only words that I can say that completely capture how I feel now and how I felt that day. But the most remarkable thing about Brandon Bernard was not his execution. It was everything that happened in the 21 years between his crime and his death, and the extraordinary campaign that tried to save him. On June 21, 1999, a group of teenagers hunted for victims in Killeen, Texas. They were members of a street gang called the 212 Piru Bloods. They had a plan: ask someone for a ride, pull a gun, rob them, lock them in their trunk, and escape. They searched parking lots for hours, looking for the right target. They found Todd and Stacie Bagley outside a convenience store. Todd was 26. Stacie was 28. They were youth ministers from Iowa, visiting Texas to attend revival services at the church where they had met and fallen in love. They were driving back from Sunday worship when they stopped so Todd could use a payphone. Christopher Villalva, 19, was the leader. Brandon Bernard was 18. 3 other teenagers, aged 15 to 17, completed the group. They approached Todd and asked for a ride. He agreed. When the couple got back in their car, Villalva pulled a gun. For the next 6 to 9 hours, Todd and Stacie Bagley were locked in the trunk of their own car while the teenagers drove around robbing them. The couple spoke through an opening in the back seat. They did not curse their captors. They did not threaten. Instead, they ministered. They talked about Jesus. They sang hymns. They urged the young men to accept God's love and turn away from violence. Stacie's last words from that trunk were, "Jesus loves you. Jesus, take care of us." Villalva drove to a remote area at Fort Hood Military Reservation. He opened the trunk and shot both victims in the head. Todd died instantly. Stacie was knocked unconscious but still breathing. Then Brandon Bernard poured lighter fluid throughout the car and set it on fire. Stacie Bagley died from smoke inhalation as the flames consumed the trunk. The teenagers tried to flee, but their car got stuck in a ditch. First responders found them trying to push it free. Firefighters discovered the burned bodies in the trunk. All 5 were arrested within hours. A jury sentenced both Villalva and Bernard to death. Then something extraordinary happened. Over 20 years on death row, Brandon Bernard never received a single disciplinary infraction. Not one. He earned a college degree. He learned to play guitar and crochet. He participated in youth outreach programs, warning at-risk kids away from gangs and violence. He expressed consistent remorse for his crime. Prison officials called him a model inmate. More remarkable still, 5 of the 9 surviving jurors who sentenced him to death came forward to say they regretted their verdict. The former federal prosecutor who defended his death sentence on appeal reversed her position and called for clemency. Reality TV star Kim Kardashian West mobilized millions of followers in a campaign to save his life. High-powered attorneys Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr joined his legal team on the day of his execution. They discovered that prosecutors had hidden evidence showing Bernard was the lowest-ranking member of his gang, barely connected to its operations. They found that an independent medical examiner concluded Stacie Bagley was medically dead from the gunshot before the fire started. They argued that an 18-year-old who showed 2 decades of rehabilitation did not deserve to die. But procedural barriers blocked every appeal. The courts never heard the merits of his claims. President Trump, who had promised the Bagley family that Bernard would be executed, refused clemency despite the mounting pressure. And so, on a cold December night during a pandemic, with COVID-19 spreading through the prison and 650,000 people signing petitions to stop it, the federal government executed Brandon Bernard anyway. This is the story of a terrible crime, a disputed death, a system that values procedure over justice, and the question that haunts everyone involved. Can someone who commits murder as a teenager but becomes a different person over 20 years still deserve to die? If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. Brandon Anthony Micah Bernard was born on July 3, 1980, at a San Antonio hospital where his mother worked as a U.S. Army nurse. His mother, Thelma Louise Johnson Bernard, dedicated her life to military service and patient care. His father, Kenneth Richmond Bernard, would prove to be an unreliable presence in the household. Brandon had two younger siblings who looked up to him as their big brother. The family's military life meant constant relocation. In 1982, when Brandon was just 2 years old, Thelma received transfer orders to Fairbanks, Alaska. The family spent 2 years in the harsh northern climate before moving again in November 1984. This time they settled in Killeen, Texas, a city adjacent to Fort Hood Army Base. Brandon would spend the majority of his childhood here, attending the local Seventh-day Adventist Academy starting in 1986. As a child, Brandon suffered from asthma, requiring careful medical attention. His mother worked long hours at the hospital, leaving young Brandon with increasing responsibilities at home. The summer of 1987 brought another temporary move when Thelma required medical training in Colorado. These frequent relocations and his mother's demanding work schedule meant Brandon often felt disconnected from stable friendships and routines. The Bernard household harbored a dangerous secret. Kenneth Bernard struggled with alcohol abuse, and his drinking led to violent outbursts. In September 1992, when Brandon was 12 years old, his intoxicated father attacked his mother. Kenneth sprayed Thelma in the face with mace, an assault that marked a turning point for the family. The divorce came in 1993. Kenneth maintained minimal involvement in his children's lives afterward, eventually experiencing periods of homelessness and relying on soup kitchens for meals. The financial strain on Thelma intensified. As a single mother working long shifts at the hospital, she struggled to provide the supervision and support her children needed. At age 12, Brandon took on adult responsibilities. After his mother's heart surgery, he became her primary caregiver during recovery. Every day after school, he cared for his two younger siblings until Thelma returned from work in the evening. These burdens weighed heavily on a child who should have been focused on schoolwork and making friends. Brandon's grades began to suffer as he struggled with the transition from his small Seventh-day Adventist elementary school to the large public high school system. The anonymity of a bigger school, combined with his home responsibilities and the trauma of witnessing domestic violence, set him on a troubling path. His childhood best friend was a dog named Peabody, named after the cartoon character from Rocky and Bullwinkle, highlighting how isolated he felt from peers his own age. In 1994, Brandon's life took another turn when his cousin Melsimeon Pollock came to live with the Bernard family. Pollock was older and possessed what family members described as an alpha male personality with a tendency toward mischief. Brandon, struggling with his identity and desperate for belonging, looked up to his cousin. Pollock needed money and saw opportunities in the quiet Killeen neighborhoods surrounding Fort Hood. In January 1995, when Brandon was 14, his cousin convinced him to help burglarize houses. These were kick-door burglaries, a straightforward crime where they would force entry and take whatever valuables they could carry quickly. His cousin needed the money, and Brandon wanted to support him and feel a sense of belonging. Pollock himself admitted that Brandon would not have broken into these houses on his own, stating that Brandon was not a mastermind but simply followed what others had planned. The cousins were eventually caught. The consequences proved severe for Brandon's already unstable life. He began bouncing between his parents' households, neither of which provided adequate structure or support. His behavior led to expulsions from multiple schools. The juvenile justice system stepped in, and Brandon spent 5 months at a juvenile residential facility in Brownwood, Texas, in 1995. At the facility, a court-appointed psychologist evaluated Brandon. The psychologist concluded that Brandon could be rehabilitated with proper therapeutic help and recommended intensive counseling. This recommendation was never implemented. The juvenile facility focused on detention rather than rehabilitation, missing a critical opportunity to address the trauma and circumstances driving Brandon's behavior. After his release, Brandon attempted to stabilize his life. In 1996, he tried to find employment but failed to secure a job. The lack of a high school diploma limited his opportunities, so he focused on education. He passed the GED examination in July 1997, a significant achievement that showed his capability when given proper support. Encouraged by this success, Brandon enrolled as a senior at Killeen High School for the 1997-1998 school year. Initially, he performed well, receiving decent grades and maintaining good attendance. For a brief period, it seemed Brandon might overcome his difficult start. However, the pull of street life and the lack of consistent guidance at home eventually overwhelmed these positive developments. His attendance and grades deteriorated as the school year progressed. In the summer of 1998, Brandon made another attempt to redirect his path. He applied to join the United States Army, following in his mother's footsteps of military service. The Army represented structure, purpose, and escape from Killeen's troubled neighborhoods. However, his juvenile offenses disqualified him from enlistment. This rejection closed off what might have been a transformative opportunity, leaving Brandon with few prospects and growing connections to local street life. Around the ages of 16 and 17, Brandon became affiliated with a local gang called the 2112 Piru Bloods. This wasn't a highly organized criminal enterprise, but rather a loose confederation of teenagers and young men in Killeen who adopted gang symbolism and engaged in criminal activities. The gang's connection to the National Bloods organization was tenuous at best, but the local members embraced the identity and the sense of belonging it provided. Brandon entered this world as a low-level member. Within the gang's structure, which witnesses would later describe as having a 13-tier hierarchy, Brandon occupied the very bottom. He wasn't a leader or even a trusted soldier. He was a follower, someone who tagged along and did what others told him to do. Through the gang, Brandon met Christopher Andre Villalva, who would become the most significant and destructive influence in his young life. Villalva was born on May 10, 1980, making him just 2 months older than Brandon. Despite their similar ages, Villalva carried himself with more authority and aggression. Villalva had his own troubled background. Born in Killeen to a white mother and an African-American father from Trinidad, his parents met at Fort Benning, Georgia. His mother was an Air Force enlistee who married at 19. The relationship proved abusive, with Villalva's father violent toward both mother and son. The father was eventually court-martialed for an undisclosed offense, and the marriage ended with Villalva's mother raising him alone. Villalva's mother faced rejection from her own family, who were white supremacists with military backgrounds. They disowned her for marrying an African-American man. This isolation left mother and son struggling. She entered into subsequent relationships with white men, but these too proved abusive. Worse, these men rejected Villalva, leaving him confused about his racial identity and his place in the world. At school, Villalva was often disciplined for being disruptive, though friends and teachers noted he wasn't inherently violent. Still, his home instability and the rejection he experienced created deep anger. By his late teenage years, Villalva had developed a reputation in certain Killeen circles. Though defense attorneys would later argue there was no evidence, he was actually a full-fledged member or leader of the 212 Piru Bloods. Brandon and Villalva, along with others in their circle, committed numerous crimes together. Bernard and Villalva committed over 24 kick-door burglaries in the Killeen area. Bernard was also involved in at least one confrontation with opposing gang members, though details of this incident remain limited. The gang provided what Brandon's fractured family could not: a sense of brotherhood, identity, and purpose. For young men growing up in the shadow of Fort Hood with limited opportunities and troubled homes, the gang filled a void. They pooled resources, protected each other, and engaged in criminal enterprises that brought quick money. This world of street crime and gang loyalty in Killeen, Texas stood in stark contrast to the life being lived hundreds of miles north in Iowa, where a young man named Todd Bagley was growing up in circumstances that could not have been more different. Todd Allen Bagley was born in Ottumwa, Iowa, a small city in Wapello County far removed from the military culture of Killeen, Texas. His parents, Ricky D. Bagley and Georgia A. Krause Bagley, raised him in a stable, faith-centered household. His paternal grandparents, Raymond Edgar Bagley and Edna Christina Alvina Noft Sweat, lived nearby, as did his maternal grandparents, George and Marcine Krause. All were from Ottumwa, providing Todd with deep roots in the community. Growing up, Todd demonstrated strong values and a desire to serve others. He chose to join the United States Army, following a tradition of military service in his family. The Army stationed him at Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, a massive military installation that served as a hub for training and deployment. At Fort Hood, Todd became involved with Grace Christian Center in Killeen, where he participated in the youth group ministry. It was there, during a church service, that Todd's life changed forever. He saw a young woman singing in the choir and fell in love with her voice, her faith, and her spirit. Her name was Stacie Lynn Woodard. Stacie had been born at Fort Campbell in Christian County, Kentucky, where her parents, Charles Woodard and Donna McClure, were stationed. Her family had moved to New Bern, Tennessee in Dyer County, where Stacie attended Dyer County High School and graduated in 1989. Like Todd's family, hers had experienced changes. Her father married Barbara Woodard, and her mother married Randy McClure, giving Stacie step-siblings Dana Ladd, Glenn McComb, and Donald McComb. Stacie's faith defined her life choices. She felt called to youth ministry, working with teenagers and young adults to strengthen their relationship with God. When she met Todd at Grace Christian Center, she found a partner who shared her devotion and her calling. Both worked with the church's youth group, organizing activities, mentoring young people, and providing spiritual guidance. Todd and Stacie fell deeply in love. They married and made their home near Fort Hood, continuing their ministry work together at Grace Christian Center. Todd worked as an assistant health director with Boslandin Athletic Club in Pella, Iowa, maintaining physical fitness while pursuing his spiritual calling. Stacie worked as a customer service representative for Heritage Lace Co. in Ottumwa, balancing work with ministry. The couple eventually moved from Texas to Iowa, where they joined Jubilee Family Church, a non-denominational evangelical charismatic church in Oskaloosa. They served as youth pastors, dedicating themselves to young people who needed guidance and support. Todd considered becoming a police officer, wanting to serve his community in another capacity, but Stacie worried about the dangers of that profession. She wanted her husband safe. In February 1999, they returned to Ottumwa, living near Pella and continuing their ministry work. Todd celebrated his 26th birthday on April 28, 1999. Stacie had turned 28 on April 1, 1999. They were a young couple with their lives ahead of them, devoted to each other and to serving God. In June 1999, Todd and Stacie made plans to return to Killeen, Texas. Grace Christian Center, where they had met and fallen in love, was hosting revival services. The revival represented a special time of worship, prayer, and spiritual renewal. Friends they had made during their time at Fort Hood still attended the church, and the couple looked forward to reconnecting with people who had been important in their lives. The Bagleys drove from Iowa to Texas, making the long journey south. They arrived in Killeen with excitement, attending a morning worship service at Fort Hood on Sunday, June 21, 1999. The service filled them with joy, surrounded by familiar faces and the spiritual community that had meant so much to them. After the service, Todd and Stacie had lunch with friends. They spent the afternoon enjoying fellowship and conversation. It was a beautiful Sunday, warm and bright, the kind of day that made them grateful for the chance to visit. As evening approached, they needed to make a phone call. Todd pulled into Mickey's convenience store in Killeen, a small shop where he could use the payphone outside. Stacie waited in their Buick LeSabre while Todd stepped out to make his call. The car, older but reliable, had served them well on the drive from Iowa. They had no reason to worry or be concerned. This was just a routine stop in a town where they had lived and worked, a place filled with memories of their courtship and early ministry together. Neither Todd nor Stacie noticed the group of teenagers at the convenience store. They had no way of knowing that these young men had been driving around Killeen for hours, searching for a victim. The teenagers were not at Mickey's by accident. They were hunting. The previous day, June 20th, 1999, 3 members of the 212 Piru Bloods had met to plan a robbery. Christopher Villalva, Christopher Lewis, and Tony Sparks discussed their scheme. They would ask someone for a ride, pretending to need help. Once inside the vehicle, they would pull a gun and take control. They would steal the victim's money and personal belongings, force them to provide their ATM PIN number, then lock the victim in the car's trunk. After robbing them thoroughly, they would abandon the vehicle with the victim still trapped inside. The plan was cruel and dangerous, but the 3 teenagers agreed to move forward. On June 21st, they contacted 2 other associates, Brandon Bernard and Terry Brown, asking them to help. The group determined they needed more firepower. They had 1 gun, a small .22 caliber pistol they considered too small to frighten anyone effectively. They needed something more intimidating. Brandon owned a .40 caliber Glock handgun, a serious weapon. However, he had loaned it to a 15-year-old named Gregory Hardin Lynch. The group drove to Lynch's house and retrieved the gun from him. Now properly armed, they set out to find their target. After 2 p.m. on June 21st, Brandon Bernard drove Christopher Villalva, Terry Brown, Christopher Lewis, and Tony Sparks through Killeen in search of someone to rob. They started at a local supermarket, circling the parking lot and looking for an opportunity. Finding no suitable target there, they continued their search, driving through parking lots at various stores throughout the city. The teenagers were looking for specific criteria. They wanted someone who appeared to have money or valuables. They wanted someone who wouldn't be immediately missed or who might not be connected to the local area. Most importantly, they wanted someone who would comply with their demands without fighting back. At some point during their search, Brandon and Brown stopped at a laundromat near Mickey's convenience store. They went inside to play video games while Villalva, Lewis, and Sparks continued looking for victims. When Villalva, Lewis, and Sparks arrived at Mickey's convenience store, they saw Todd Bagley using the payphone. His wife sat in their car nearby. The couple looked perfect for their purposes. They appeared to be visiting from out of town based on their Iowa license plates. They were alone and seemed kind and trusting. Todd was physically fit but didn't look aggressive. The teenagers made their decision. Christopher Lewis and Tony Sparks approached Todd while he was on the phone. They asked if he could give them a ride to their uncle's house, spinning a story about needing help. Todd, raised to help others and guided by his Christian faith, didn't hesitate. He told them to wait a moment while he finished his call, then consulted with Stacie. The couple agreed to give the strangers a ride. Lewis and Sparks got into the back seat of the Buick LeSabre. What Todd and Stacie didn't know was that Christopher Villalva had been hiding in the back, waiting for them. As Todd began driving according to the directions Villalva provided, the trap closed. Villalva pulled out the .40 caliber Glock that had belonged to Brandon Bernard. He pointed the gun at Todd's head and gave a cold command. "Stop the car." Todd, realizing the terrible situation they had entered, complied. "Plans have changed," Villalva announced. Under gunpoint, Villalva forced Todd and Stacie out of the front seats and ordered them to climb into the trunk of their own car. The couple, terrified but trying to survive, did as they were told. The trunk lid slammed shut, trapping them in darkness. Villalva took the driver's seat, Lewis remained in the car, and they drove away from Mickey's. Brandon and Brown, still at the laundromat, observed their associates getting into the Bagleys' vehicle. They watched it drive away, then returned to wait for further contact. Todd and Stacie Bagley found themselves locked in the trunk of their Buick LaSalle, driven by strangers who had just revealed violent intentions. The trunk was cramped and dark, the Texas heat making it difficult to breathe. The temperature inside the confined space climbed rapidly as the afternoon sun beat down on the metal exterior. Sweat soaked their clothes as they tried to find comfortable positions in the limited space, their bodies pressed against spare tire equipment and the hard interior walls. But the Bagleys were not ordinary victims. Their faith sustained them even in this nightmare. The couple discovered an opening between the trunk and the back seat, a gap common in older vehicles where the rear seat back could be accessed from inside the trunk. Through this opening, they could see glimpses of their captors and speak to them directly. Rather than curse or threaten, rather than beg uselessly or fall into despair, Todd and Stacie did what came naturally to them. They began to minister. They urged Christopher Villalva and Christopher Lewis to accept Jesus into their hearts. Their voices carried through that small opening with remarkable clarity and conviction. They talked about God's love and forgiveness, explaining that redemption was available to everyone. They told the teenagers that no sin was too great for God's mercy. They explained that everyone could be saved, no matter what they had done. They pleaded for their lives, yes, but they also pleaded for the souls of the young men who had kidnapped them. Even in captivity, even facing probable death, the Bagleys remained faithful to their calling as ministers. Villalva drove around Killeen and the surrounding area for hours, maintaining control of the situation while his companions discussed what to do next. The drive took them through familiar streets near Fort Hood, past shopping centers and residential neighborhoods where people went about their ordinary Thursday afternoon activities, unaware of the terror unfolding in the trunk of the car passing by. He stopped at various ATM machines, forcing the Bagleys to provide their PIN number through the trunk opening. Todd complied, hoping cooperation might save their lives. The teenagers withdrew what cash they could from the account, though it amounted to only about $20. The paltry sum seemed to frustrate them. They had imagined this robbery would yield significant money, but the Bagleys were not wealthy people. They were young ministers living on modest incomes, more concerned with spiritual riches than material wealth. The group drove to pawn shops around Killeen with Stacie's wedding ring, a symbol of her commitment to Todd and their marriage. The ring held immense sentimental value, but little monetary worth. Shop after shop refused to take it, either because they suspected it was stolen or because it simply was not valuable enough to interest them. The teenagers grew increasingly agitated with each rejection. They took other jewelry, credit cards, a checkbook, and personal items from the Bagleys' possessions, rifling through their belongings with no regard for the meaning these items held. Throughout these hours, the Bagleys continued speaking to their captors. They sang hymns from the trunk, their voices rising together in songs they had sung countless times in church services. The hymn, "Jesus Loves Me," echoed from that dark space, a children's song that took on profound meaning in this context. They asked questions about whether Lewis and Sparks attended church, whether they believed in God, whether their mothers had raised them with faith. According to testimony later provided by Lewis, the Bagleys asked them about Jesus and urged them to turn away from violence. They shared scripture passages they had memorized, offering spiritual guidance even to those who held them captive. Stacie's voice, in particular, seemed to reach the younger teenagers. She spoke with maternal warmth, asking about their lives and families. She told them that Jesus loved them, that God had a plan for their lives that did not include violence and crime. She explained that it was not too late to change, that mercy was always available to those who sought it genuinely. Her words, delivered with sincerity and compassion despite her circumstances, created a strange and uncomfortable dynamic in the car. The teenagers, particularly the younger ones, seemed affected by this treatment. Lewis and Sparks had expected their victims to beg, scream, or threaten. They had expected curses and desperate pleas. Instead, they encountered two people who treated them with compassion, even while imprisoned in a trunk. The cognitive dissonance troubled them. These were supposed to be just victims, faceless people to rob and discard. But Todd and Stacie insisted on being seen as human beings, as children of God, as people who cared about the souls of their captors, even while fearing for their own lives. As the afternoon turned to evening, the reality of the situation became clearer to Villalba. The original plan had been simple: rob someone, lock them in a trunk, abandon the vehicle somewhere remote, and escape before the victims could free themselves or be discovered. But this plan had a fatal flaw. The Bagleys had seen Villalba's face clearly. They had been talking to him for hours. They knew what he looked like. They could identify him to police. More than that, they had been urging him to accept Jesus, speaking to him by name, creating a personal connection that made it harder to view them as mere obstacles. Villalba and Lewis contacted Brandon Bernard and Terry Brown, who had been waiting for instructions after observing the initial kidnapping at the convenience store. They needed help completing their crime. The plan had changed. Villalba told Bernard and Brown that the Bagleys had to die. There was no other way to ensure they could not identify him to authorities. Brandon and Brown, perhaps not fully grasping what they were about to participate in, agreed to meet up with Villalba and Lewis. Around 8 p.m., as darkness began to fall over Killeen, the group made a stop at Tony Sparks's home. Sparks needed to return before he violated his probation for another crime, and his absence from home would raise questions from his probation officer. The younger teenagers were beginning to sense the gravity of what was happening. The initial excitement of the robbery had given way to something darker and more frightening. They dropped Sparks off, handing him the jewelry they had been unable to pawn as a sort of consolation prize for his participation. Then Villalba, Lewis, Bernard, and Brown continued with their captives still locked in the trunk, their voices still audible through that opening, still praying and singing. Brandon and Brown stopped at a store to purchase supplies. Not gasoline for the car, not food or water, but lighter fluid. Multiple containers of it, the kind used for barbecue grills and outdoor fires. The purchase was deliberate and ominous. They knew what Villalba intended to do. They were buying the accelerant that would destroy the evidence of the crime, and they understood that the evidence included 2 human beings locked in a trunk. 2 people who had spent hours trying to save their souls. Christopher Villalba drove the Bagleys' Buick LeSabre to the Belton Lake Recreation Area on the Fort Hood Military Reservation. This location was isolated, away from the main roads, perfect for what he planned to do. The area featured dirt roads and undeveloped land, with few witnesses likely to pass by on a Sunday evening. Villalba parked the car on top of a small hill. He turned off the engine. In the trunk, Todd and Stacie Bagley could sense something was about to happen. They continued praying and singing. According to Terry Brown, they sang the hymn "Jesus Loves Me," their voices carrying from the trunk into the evening air. Brandon Bernard and Terry Brown opened the containers of lighter fluid they had purchased. Following Villalba's instructions, they began pouring the flammable liquid onto the interior of the car. The fluid splashed across the seats and floorboards. The smell filled the vehicle. Still, from the trunk came the sound of Todd and Stacie singing and praying. Stacie repeated her message. "Jesus loves you. Jesus, take care of us." Villalba's response was crude. He cursed at her in reply. Then he donned a ski mask, hiding his face even though his victims had already seen him clearly during the hours of captivity. He told Christopher Lewis to open the trunk. Lewis pulled the trunk release. The lid swung up, revealing Todd and Stacie Bagley inside, alive and conscious. They looked up at their captors, perhaps hoping for mercy even now. Villalba raised the .40 caliber Glock handgun. He shot Todd Bagley in the head. The bullet killed him instantly. Todd died there in the trunk, his wife beside him. Villalba turned the gun on Stacie. He shot her in the right side of her face. The bullet struck her with tremendous force, rendering her unconscious. But unlike her husband, Stacie did not die immediately. The shot had knocked her out but left her alive, breathing, her heart still beating. Villalba closed the trunk, locking both bodies inside. He gave the order to Brandon Bernard. "Burn it." Brandon set the car on fire. The lighter fluid ignited immediately, flames spreading through the interior of the vehicle. The fire consumed the seats, the dashboard, everything it touched. It crept toward the trunk where Todd's body lay beside his unconscious wife. The 4 teenagers ran from the burning car. Villalva, Lewis, Bernard, and Brown scrambled down the hill toward Brandon's vehicle, which they had left on a nearby road. Behind them, flames engulfed the Buick LeSabre, black smoke rising into the darkening sky. They needed to get away before someone saw the fire and called authorities. They reached Brandon's car and jumped inside. Brandon took the wheel and accelerated, trying to put distance between them and the crime scene, but panic and inexperience betrayed them. As Brandon drove along the dirt road, the car slid off into a muddy ditch. The wheels spun uselessly, unable to gain traction in the soft earth. The teenagers climbed out and tried to push the vehicle free. They rocked it back and forth, attempting to build momentum. The car remained stuck. They were trapped at the scene of their crime, covered in mud, breathing hard from exertion and fear. First responders had already been alerted to the fire. Someone had seen the smoke and called it in. Firefighters and Fort Hood military police raced toward Belton Lake Recreation Area. When they arrived, they found the burning vehicle and immediately began working to extinguish the flames. They also found 4 muddy teenagers trying to free a car from a ditch nearby. The connection was obvious. The firefighters and police secured the scene and detained Villalva, Lewis, Bernard, and Brown. Within moments, the 5 young men who had planned to rob someone and escape cleanly found themselves in custody. As firefighters brought the car fire under control, they approached the burned vehicle with caution. The heat had been intense, warping metal and consuming everything flammable. They opened the trunk and discovered what they had feared. 2 bodies lay inside, charred beyond easy recognition. The crime scene investigators who arrived later would describe the sight as overwhelming. The image would haunt everyone who witnessed it. The victims' bodies were so severely burned that identification required checking personal effects, vehicle registration, and contacting family in Iowa for confirmation. Ballistics experts later recovered .40 caliber bullets from the scene. These matched the Glock handgun that belonged to Brandon Bernard, the weapon Christopher Villalva had used to shoot the Bagleys in the head. Forensic analysis of the lighter fluid accelerant confirmed it had been poured throughout the interior of the vehicle before ignition. The 5 teenagers were separated and taken into custody. A 6th person, 15-year-old Gregory Hardin Lynch, was later arrested for providing the murder weapon. Lynch had loaned Brandon's gun to the group, making him an accessory to the crime. Within hours of the murders, all the perpetrators were in jail. The crime had been planned poorly and executed worse. What was supposed to be a simple robbery had become a double homicide on federal property. Because the murders took place at Fort Hood, a military reservation, this would be prosecuted as a federal crime rather than a state case. The jurisdiction meant the defendants faced the federal death penalty. Federal authorities from multiple agencies descended on the crime scene. The Fort Hood Military Police, the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and local law enforcement from Killeen all participated in the investigation. The crime had occurred on federal property, making it a matter for federal prosecutors. Investigators worked through the night documenting evidence. They photographed the burned vehicle from every angle. They mapped the location where the car had been found and where the defendant's vehicle had gotten stuck in the ditch. They collected the shell casings from the bullets that killed the Bagleys. They took samples of the lighter fluid residue. The medical examiner performed autopsies on both victims. Todd Bagley's cause of death was straightforward: a gunshot wound to the head that had killed him instantly. Stacie Bagley's autopsy proved more complex. The medical examiner found the gunshot wound to her face, but also discovered soot in her larynx, trachea, and bronchi. Toxicology tests revealed high levels of carbon monoxide in her blood. The official determination listed her cause of death as gunshot wound to the head, associated with smoke inhalation and thermal injury. Detectives interrogated the suspects separately. Christopher Lewis and Terry Brown agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. They would plead guilty to second-degree murder and testify against Christopher Villalva and Brandon Bernard. Their testimony would provide the detailed timeline of the crime. Lewis described how Villalba, Sparks, and he had approached Todd Bagley at the payphone. He explained how they had forced the couple into the trunk and driven around for hours. He testified that the Bagleys had spoken to them about God and Jesus, reading Bible passages, and pleading for their lives. Brown corroborated Lewis's account and added specific details about the murder scene. He testified that Stacie's last words from the trunk were, "Jesus loves you, and Jesus, take care of us." He described how Villalba had cursed at her in response. He witnessed Villalba shooting both victims in the head and saw Brandon Bernard set the car on fire. Tony Sparks also cooperated with authorities. He had been dropped off at home before the murders, making him less culpable than the others. He pleaded guilty to his role in the kidnapping and robbery, but was not charged with the murders themselves. Gregory Hardin Lynch faced charges for providing the weapon. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess a stolen firearm, admitting he had given Brandon Bernard's gun to the group, knowing they planned to use it in a crime. Brandon Bernard gave a post-arrest statement to investigators. He admitted that he had spread lighter fluid around the interior of the Bagley's car and set it on fire. He acknowledged knowing there were people in the trunk. His statement confirmed his direct participation in the murder, even though he had not pulled the trigger. Christopher Villalba refused to cooperate. He exercised his right to remain silent, knowing the evidence against him was overwhelming. Villalba understood he was the primary perpetrator, the one who had shot both victims in the head. As the investigation proceeded, details emerged about the 212 Piru Bloods gang. Prosecutors learned about the gang's structure and activities in Killeen. They documented Bernard and Villalba's involvement in numerous burglaries together. They established a pattern of criminal behavior leading up to the murders. The evidence painted a clear picture of premeditation. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. The teenagers had planned to kidnap and rob someone. When their victims could identify them, they chose murder. Federal prosecutors faced important decisions about how to charge the defendants. Christopher Villalba and Brandon Bernard, as the two oldest members of the group and the ones most directly responsible for the deaths, would face capital charges. The Federal Death Penalty Act of 1994 provided the framework for seeking death sentences in federal court. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Scott Frost, built their case around several key factors. The crime had involved kidnapping and carjacking, both federal offenses. The murders had occurred on a military reservation, establishing clear federal jurisdiction. The victims were young ministers who had shown their captors nothing but kindness and compassion, making the crime particularly cruel. Most importantly for Brandon Bernard's case, the prosecution would argue that he had killed Stacie Bagley through his actions. While Villalba had shot both victims, the medical evidence suggested Stacie had still been alive when Bernard set the fire. Her death from smoke inhalation made Bernard directly responsible for murder, not just for being an accomplice. The defense attorneys faced an enormous challenge. Russell David Hunt Sr. represented Brandon Bernard, assisted by his son Russell D. Hunt Jr. The senior Hunt had chaired 3 prior death penalty cases for the defense and 1 as a prosecutor. His son had tried over 24 state felony cases and assisted in defending 2 capital cases. They were experienced attorneys, but they were also court-appointed, working with limited resources. B. Dwight Goines represented Christopher Villalba, along with an experienced co-counsel. Goines had extensive death penalty case experience and was board-certified in criminal law. Like Bernard's attorneys, they faced overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt. The defense teams made a critical strategic decision early in the case. They chose not to contest the basic facts. The evidence was too strong. Multiple witnesses, including their client's own accomplices, would testify to what had happened. The physical evidence corroborated every element of the prosecution's case. Fighting the guilt phase aggressively seemed futile. Instead, the defense attorneys focused on the penalty phase. If they could not prevent conviction, they would try to save their clients from execution. This strategy required presenting mitigating evidence about their clients' backgrounds, their youth, and their potential for rehabilitation. However, the defense made decisions that would later be criticized as ineffective assistance of counsel. They conducted limited investigation into their clients' backgrounds. They did not hire forensic experts to challenge the medical examiner's conclusions about Stacie Bagley's cause of death. They prepared minimal evidence for the guilt phase of the trial. The prosecution, meanwhile, prepared extensively. They interviewed family members of the victims, documenting the impact of the crime. They consulted with gang experts to testify about the 212 Piru Bloods. They lined up forensic psychiatrists to discuss the defendant's future dangerousness. They prepared detailed presentations of the crime scene evidence and autopsy findings. One decision that would prove controversial was the prosecution's choice to try Villalba and Bernard together. Villalba had been the ringleader and shooter. Bernard had been an accomplice who set the fire. Their culpability differed significantly. Defense attorneys for both men argued the trials should be severed, allowing each defendant to be judged independently. The court denied these motions, ruling that a joint trial was appropriate given their joint participation in the crime. The trial of Christopher Villalba and Brandon Bernard opened in U.S. District Court in Waco, Texas in the spring of 2000, exactly 1 year after the murders. The case drew significant attention in Central Texas. The brutality of the crime, combined with the youth of the defendants and the religious nature of the victims, made it a major news story. Jury selection proved crucial and controversial. The jury pool came from the Western District of Texas, which encompassed multiple counties. The selection process resulted in a jury of 12 people, 11 white and 1 black. Given that both defendants were black and both victims were white, this racial composition would later fuel arguments about bias in the criminal justice system. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their case methodically. They described how the defendants had planned a robbery and carjacking. They explained the hours of terror the Bagleys endured, locked in the trunk. They detailed the cold-blooded shootings and the fire that killed Stacie Bagley. They promised to prove beyond reasonable doubt that both defendants deserved the maximum punishment under federal law. The defense made a decision that would haunt the case for years. Brandon Bernard's attorneys gave no opening statement during the guilt phase. They offered the jury no alternative perspective on the charges, no framework for understanding their client's actions, no reason to see him differently than the prosecution portrayed him. They remained silent. Christopher Lewis took the stand as the prosecution's key witness. He had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his cooperation. Lewis walked the jury through the entire day of June 21, 1999. He described how he, Villalba, and Sparks had approached Todd Bagley at the convenience store. He explained how Villalba had hidden in the back seat before pulling the gun. Lewis testified about the hours driving around Killeen with the Bagleys locked in the trunk. He told the jury how the couple had spoken to them about God and Jesus. He described Stacie reading Bible passages and both victims pleading for their lives. His testimony brought many in the courtroom to tears. Terry Brown corroborated Lewis's testimony. He provided additional details about the murder scene at Belton Lake. He testified that he had helped Bernard pour lighter fluid throughout the car while the Bagleys sang "Jesus Loves Me" from the trunk. He described Stacie's final words, "Jesus loves you. Jesus, take care of us." Brown testified that Villalba had cursed at Stacie before shooting both victims. He witnessed the shootings and saw Bernard set the fire. His testimony directly linked Bernard to Stacie's death. Tony Sparks testified about the planning phase and his role in the initial abduction. Though he had been dropped off before the murders, his testimony established the premeditation aspect of the crime. The defendants had discussed their plan. They had obtained weapons. They had searched for victims. This was not an impulsive act, but a calculated crime. The prosecution presented forensic evidence. Crime scene investigators showed photographs of the burned vehicle and the victims' remains. The images were graphic and disturbing. Several jurors appeared visibly affected by what they saw. One juror who sat directly in front of the monitor would later say she could never get the sight of those burned bodies out of her mind. The medical examiner took the stand and explained the autopsy findings in detail. She described the gunshot wounds to both victims. For Todd Bagley, the cause of death was clear and immediate. For Stacie Bagley, the medical examiner explained the presence of soot in her airways and the high carbon monoxide levels in her blood. She testified that these findings indicated Stacie had been breathing when the fire started, inhaling smoke that ultimately killed her. This testimony became the cornerstone of the death penalty case against Brandon Bernard. Assistant U.S. Attorney Scott Frost emphasized it repeatedly. When Brandon Bernard lit that fire, he stressed, Stacie Bagley was still living. Brandon Bernard burned her alive. The defense called no witnesses during the guilt phase. They presented no forensic experts to challenge the medical examiner's conclusions. They offered no alternative interpretation of the evidence. When the prosecution rested, so did the defense. On June 1, 2000, after relatively brief deliberations, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. With guilt established, the trial moved to its penalty phase. Under the Federal Death Penalty Act, the same jury that convicted the defendants would now decide whether they should live or die. The prosecution needed to prove aggravating factors that justified death sentences. The defense could present mitigating factors arguing for life imprisonment. The prosecution's strategy focused on future dangerousness. They argued that both Villalba and Bernard posed continuing threats to society. Even in prison, they would remain violent and dangerous. The prosecutors emphasized the defendants' gang membership and their extensive criminal histories. A Bureau of Prisons employee who monitored gang activity in federal prisons testified about how gangs operate behind bars. He explained that gang members must make their bones by committing crimes and assaults in prison. He described a violent hierarchy where new members prove themselves through increasingly serious infractions. Though he didn't speak specifically about Villalba or Bernard, the implication was clear. These young gang members would bring violence into any prison that held them. Dr. Richard Coons, a forensic psychiatrist, testified about the defendants' propensity for violence. He discussed their gang involvement, their criminal histories, and their participation in over 24 burglaries. Based on his evaluation, Dr. Coons concluded that the defendants posed a serious risk of future harm to others. The prosecution presented evidence of the defendants' gang affiliation with the 212 Piru Bloods. They argued that all gang members were essentially equal, part of a violent criminal enterprise. This characterization would later prove false, but at trial, the defense did not effectively challenge it. The prosecution also emphasized the particularly cruel nature of the crime. The Bagleys had been tortured for hours, locked in a trunk while their captors stole their money and belongings. They had shown their killers nothing but compassion and spiritual guidance. They had sung hymns and prayed for the souls of the teenagers who would murder them. The crime represented a profound betrayal of human kindness. The defense finally began presenting their case. Brandon Bernard's mother, Thelma Bernard, took the stand. She struggled emotionally as she testified. She acknowledged the suffering of the Bagley family and tried to explain her son's background. She described the instability of his childhood, the frequent moves, the domestic violence he had witnessed. But Thelma's testimony contained a painful honesty that may have hurt more than it helped. She said she tried to put herself in the position of Todd and Stacie Bagley. How would she feel if someone had done this to her children? The acknowledgement of the victim's humanity was appropriate, but it left the jury without a clear reason to show her son mercy. The defense called only a handful of other witnesses, despite numerous people willing to testify on Bernard's behalf. They did not present extensive evidence about his difficult childhood, his role as a caretaker for his siblings, or his attempts to turn his life around by getting his GED and trying to join the army. They did not call experts on adolescent brain development or the effects of childhood trauma. Most critically, they did not present any forensic expert to challenge the medical examiner's testimony about Stacie Bagley's cause of death. An expert could have explained the distinction between medical death and forensic death, potentially creating reasonable doubt about whether Bernard's fire setting actually killed her, or whether she was already beyond saving from the gunshot wound. Victim impact evidence came from the Bagley family. Stacie's mother, Donna McClure, gave a statement that troubled even the appeals court that later reviewed it. She addressed Bernard and Villalba directly, warning them that heaven and hell were real. She called on them to put their faith in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of their sins. This religious appeal was arguably beyond the scope of proper victim impact testimony, but neither defense attorney objected. The penalty phase lasted 4 days, from June 8 to June 12, 2000. The jury then began their deliberations on whether the defendants should receive death sentences. The jury deliberated over 2 days, wrestling with one of the most difficult decisions any group of citizens can face: whether another human being should be executed. Under federal law, the jury needed to determine whether aggravating factors outweighed mitigating factors for each defendant on each count. On the first day, the jury reached some decisions. They recommended life imprisonment for Christopher Villalba on count 2 and for Brandon Bernard on counts 1, 2, and 3. These were significant choices, showing the jury's willingness to consider circumstances that might weigh against the ultimate punishment. But on June 13, 2000, the second day of deliberations, the jury returned with their final recommendations. For Christopher Villalba, they recommended death sentences on 3 counts: the carjacking resulting in death and the first-degree murders of both Todd and Stacie Bagley. As the ringleader and shooter, Villalba bore the greatest responsibility. For Brandon Bernard, the jury recommended a death sentence on count 4, the first-degree murder of Stacie Bagley. They had determined that Brandon's act of setting the car on fire while she still lived made him deserving of execution. Gary McClung, one of the jurors, would later describe the difficulty of this decision. The penalty phase was not easy for him. He felt uncomfortable giving Brandon Bernard the death penalty and had been bothered by his decision ever since. He and another juror had been wavering, uncertain whether death was appropriate for Bernard, given his lesser role compared to Villalba. The jury's sole black member, who has since died, influenced the final decision. According to McClung's later recollection, this juror told the wavering members that he was familiar with the gang. "I know these boys," he said. "Ain't none of them any good." This statement from a black juror about black defendants seemed to carry particular weight, pushing the uncertain jurors toward death sentences. The determining factor for several jurors was the medical evidence about Stacie's death. They believed that she had still been alive when Brandon set the fire, that she had died from smoke inhalation rather than from the gunshot. One juror later explained in a declaration that this evidence was the main reason he voted for the death penalty. If he had known different information about her cause of death, he would have made a different decision. The trial judge, following the jury's recommendations, sentenced Christopher Villalba to death on 3 counts and life imprisonment on 1 count. He sentenced Brandon Bernard to death on 1 count and life imprisonment on 3 counts. These were the first federal death sentences in the Western District of Texas. U.S. Attorney Bill Blagg announced the verdicts to the media, describing them as justice for the Bagley family. Brandon Bernard was 19 years old when he received his death sentence. He had been 18 at the time of the crime. He would spend the next 20 years on federal death row, longer than he had lived as a free person. Christopher Villalba was 20 years old at sentencing, 19 at the time of the crime. He too faced decades waiting for execution. The other defendants received very different outcomes. Christopher Lewis and Terry Brown, who had cooperated with prosecutors, each received 248 months, approximately 20 years. Tony Sparks, who was 16 at the time and had not participated in the actual murders, received life without parole. Gregory Hardin Lynch, the 15-year-old who provided the gun, received 5 years. The disparities were stark. The 2 oldest defendants, who were barely adults, received death. The cooperating witnesses received 20 years. The youngest received terms ranging from 5 years to life, depending on their specific roles. Brandon Bernard entered the federal death row unit at United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. The Special Confinement Unit housed condemned prisoners in isolated cells, where they spent 23 hours each day. 1 hour of recreation outside their cells represented the only break from solitary confinement. The conditions were harsh and dehumanizing. Bernard had no physical contact with other human beings except for the guards who escorted him in restraints. When family members visited, they spoke through a small air hole in a glass barrier. The hole allowed sound to pass but was too small for hands to touch. Bernard would later tell a supporter that during his final family visit, he could smell his mother through that air hole. In 20 years, he never once hugged her. Many prisoners deteriorate under such conditions. Isolation drives some to madness. Others become violent and predatory, fulfilling the prophecy that led to their segregation. Brandon Bernard chose a different path. He maintained a completely clean disciplinary record. In 20 years on death row, he received 0 infractions, not a single violation, not a single fight, not a single incident of disrespect toward staff or other prisoners. This record was remarkable and unprecedented. Prison officials who dealt with him regularly noted his respectful demeanor and cooperative attitude. Bernard used his time to educate himself. He read extensively, consuming books on philosophy, religion, and history. He earned college credits through correspondence courses. Eventually, he completed an associate's degree from Delaware State University, a significant achievement given the limited resources available to death row prisoners. He learned new skills. Bernard taught himself to play guitar, though access to an instrument was limited. He took up crocheting, a hobby that might seem unusual for a young man, but provided both creative outlet and practical purpose. Bernard became quite skilled, making blankets, hats, and scarves. He started a crocheting group among death row inmates, sharing patterns and techniques. The items he created were given to family members during visits. Most importantly, Bernard embraced faith. He became deeply religious, studying the Bible and developing a personal relationship with God. This faith drove him to reach out to at-risk youth on the outside, trying to prevent them from making the mistakes he had made. In 2006, twin brothers David and Michael Boyd, who ran a Seventh-day Adventist youth outreach program called the Enlightenment Tour, contacted Bernard. They had known him in Killeen and wondered if he would share his story with young people. Bernard agreed without hesitation. He participated in the program voluntarily, expecting nothing in return except the chance to warn kids away from gangs and violence. Michael Boyd later wrote a declaration describing Bernard's commitment. "Brandon did this out of his own will," Boyd explained. "He did not expect anything from us except to get his message out to the kids." Bernard's message was simple. One bad decision can destroy your life and the lives of others. Choose differently than I chose. Bernard also maintained relationships with family members as best he could through letters and those limited visits. He had 2 daughters, Kiara and Tanea, from previous relationships. The girls first met each other as teenagers in the visiting room at Terre Haute. They couldn't embrace their father, but they could talk to him through the glass, and he could be emotionally present for them, even while physically separated. Brandon Bernard and Christopher Villalva appealed their convictions through the federal court system. In 2002, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed both convictions and death sentences, finding no reversible error. Bernard's attorneys then filed a habeas corpus petition claiming ineffective assistance of counsel, but the district court denied it, and the Fifth Circuit refused further appeal. Bernard's legal team made additional attempts for relief, including arguing that Judge Walter Smith, who handled post-conviction proceedings, had been impaired due to inappropriate conduct with courthouse staff while appearing intoxicated. These arguments were rejected. By January 19, 2016, Bernard had exhausted all appeals. However, the federal government's moratorium on executions since 2003 meant he remained on death row without an execution date. The critical breakthrough came in 2018. While reviewing documents from co-defendant Tony Sparks's resentencing, Bernard's attorneys discovered testimony from Killeen Police Sergeant Sandra Hunt, a gang expert who had never testified at Bernard's trial. Hunt had created a 13-tier organizational chart of the 212 Piru Bloods, showing Bernard at the very bottom, about 30 people below Sparks, describing him as being on the very periphery of the gang. This contradicted the prosecution's trial argument that all gang members were essentially equal. The prosecution had possessed this evidence but never disclosed it to the defense, violating Brady v. Maryland. Bernard's attorneys argued that knowing his true low-level gang status might have prevented the jury from finding him a future danger, which was essential to the death penalty recommendation. However, federal courts faced a procedural dilemma. Bernard had already filed one habeas petition, and federal law strictly limits successive petitions. On September 9, 2020, the Fifth Circuit denied Bernard's motion without considering the Brady violation on its merits, ruling it was procedurally barred. Bernard appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing he couldn't have raised the Brady claim earlier when the evidence was hidden. 3 justices agreed. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by Justices Breyer and Kagan, wrote a dissent, noting the rule perversely rewards the government for keeping exculpatory information secret. She found reasonable probability the suppressed evidence would have changed the outcome, especially since 5 surviving jurors stated they would not have voted for death with this information. The Supreme Court majority declined to intervene without written opinion. The procedural barriers stood. Sotomayor's final words captured the injustice. Today, the court allows the federal government to execute Brandon Bernard, despite Bernard's troubling allegations that the government secured his death sentence by withholding exculpatory evidence and knowingly eliciting false testimony against him. Bernard has never had the opportunity to test the merits of those claims in court. Now he never will. On July 25, 2019, Attorney General William Barr made an announcement that would change everything for Brandon Bernard and the other federal death row prisoners. The Department of Justice was resuming federal executions after a 17-year hiatus. Barr stated that the condemned inmates were among the worst criminals and that bringing justice to the victims was long overdue. The decision came during the Trump administration's final year in office. Federal executions had been paused since 2003 due to legal challenges over lethal injection protocols and broader questions about capital punishment. The resumption represented a dramatic policy shift. The first execution took place on July 14, 2020. Daniel Lewis Lee, a white supremacist convicted of murdering a family including an 8-year-old girl, was executed at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. 2 more executions followed quickly. Wesley Perkey and Dustin Honkin, both white men. The pace was unprecedented. Within weeks, the federal government had conducted more executions than in the previous 56 years combined. By September 2020, 6 federal prisoners had been put to death. All of them were white men, a pattern that seemed calculated to minimize controversy during the summer of 2020, when Black Lives Matter protests swept the nation following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. On September 24, 2020, Christopher Villalba became the 7th person executed since the resumption. He was the first black inmate put to death in this new wave of executions. His case had drawn attention from civil rights advocates who argued that racial bias had played a role in his death sentence, given the nearly all-white jury and the prosecution's emphasis on gang stereotypes. Villalba released a video before his execution expressing remorse. "I committed a grave wrong when I was a lost kid and took 2 precious lives from this world," he said. "Every day, I wish I could right this wrong." His last meal consisted of Pizza Hut. His final words were, "Father, heal their hearts with grace and love. I'm ready, Father." He was pronounced dead at 6:46 p.m. Central Time. On October 16, 2020, the Department of Justice announced 5 more execution dates, all scheduled for December and January, spanning the presidential transition period. This was historically unprecedented. No federal executions had occurred during a lame duck presidency in 130 years. The timing raised obvious questions about political motivations. One of those scheduled executions was Brandon Bernard, set for December 10, 2020. 3 other men and 1 woman were scheduled to die before President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20, 2021. Biden had campaigned on ending the federal death penalty, meaning these would likely be the last federal executions for the foreseeable future. The COVID-19 pandemic added another layer of controversy. Each execution brought approximately 125 people into the Terre Haute prison complex, including 40 out-of-state Bureau of Prisons employees who formed the execution team. After the execution of Orlando Hall on November 19, 2020, 6 execution team members and more than a dozen prison staff tested positive for coronavirus. By early December, the Terre Haute prison was experiencing a serious outbreak. Positive cases among inmates had risen from 202 on December 4 to 326 by December 8. At least 14 of the 15 death row inmates had tested positive for COVID-19. Yet the Department of Justice refused to delay any executions. States across the country had largely halted executions due to the pandemic. No state had conducted an execution since July 2020. But the federal government pressed forward, making the executions potential superspreader events during the worst phase of the pandemic. As Brandon Bernard's execution date approached, an extraordinary campaign emerged to save his life. It began with his legal team, led by attorney Robert Owen, who had represented Bernard for 20 years. Owen created a website called helpsavebrandon.com, featuring photographs, testimonials, and a detailed clemency petition. The petition highlighted numerous factors that Owen believed warranted commutation to life imprisonment. Bernard had been only 18 years old at the time of the crime, with an adolescent brain not fully developed in areas controlling impulse and judgment. He had not been present when the Bagleys were initially kidnapped. He was a low-level gang member who had followed orders from older, more dominant personalities. Most compellingly, Bernard had maintained a completely clean disciplinary record for over 20 years on death row. He had earned a college degree, participated in youth outreach programs, and demonstrated genuine remorse for his actions. He represented exactly the kind of rehabilitation that the criminal justice system claimed to value. 5 of the 9 surviving trial jurors came forward publicly to support clemency. This was remarkable. Jurors rarely recant their verdicts in capital cases, but these 5 individuals, including jury foreman Calvin Kruger, stated they would not have voted for death if they had known the full facts. Gary McClung was the most vocal. "The death penalty is far too harsh for his level of involvement in this crime," he said. McClung explained that the medical evidence about Stacie's death had been the determining factor for him. An independent medical examiner hired after trial had concluded that Stacie was medically dead before the fire started. If this information had been presented at trial, McClung said definitively, he would have made a different decision. Then came an even more surprising supporter. Angela Moore, the former federal prosecutor who had defended Bernard's death sentence on appeal. Moore had left the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2002 and spent nearly 2 decades reflecting on the case. In November 2020, she wrote a powerful op-ed calling for clemency. Moore cited recent research on adolescent brain development showing that 18-year-olds lack full impulse control. She referenced studies demonstrating that Black teenagers are systematically denied the benefit of their youth and viewed as more blameworthy than white teenagers in identical circumstances. She noted Bernard's exemplary prison record. "I always took pride in representing the United States as a federal prosecutor," she wrote, "and I think executing Brandon would be a terrible stain on the nation's honor." The campaign gained momentum when reality television star Kim Kardashian West took up Bernard's cause. Kardashian had become involved in criminal justice reform in 2018, successfully advocating for Alice Marie Johnson's release. She had millions of social media followers and direct access to President Trump. Kardashian tweeted extensively about Bernard's case. While Brandon did participate in this crime, she wrote, his role was minor compared to that of the other teens involved, 2 of whom are home from prison now. She emphasized his clean prison record and his work with at-risk youth. "A terrible crime was committed," she acknowledged, "and me fighting for a stay of execution does not take away from the sympathy I have for the victims Todd and Stacie Bagley and their families. 23 elected and former prosecutors filed an amicus brief citing prosecutorial misconduct. Senators Dick Durbin and Cory Booker urged clemency. Reverend Jesse Jackson called on Trump to commute all death sentences. Nearly 100 criminal justice officials signed a statement opposing the December and January executions. An online petition gathered more than 650,000 signatures. The campaign generated massive media coverage, with articles in major newspapers and segments on national television news. Most remarkably, two of the attorneys who had defended Trump during his impeachment hearings joined Bernard's legal team on the day of his scheduled execution. Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr filed papers requesting a 2-week delay so they could fully review the case. December 10, 2020 began with Brandon Bernard scheduled to die at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. His attorneys filed emergency motions in multiple courts, arguing the Brady violation, the racial bias in jury composition, and the inadequate defense representation. They requested stays of execution to allow proper consideration of these claims. Kim Kardashian spoke with Bernard by phone in the afternoon. The conversation devastated her. Brandon, selfless as always, was focused on his family and making sure they are okay, she tweeted. He told me not to cry because our fight isn't over. Bernard confided that he was claustrophobic and had been offered a sedative to calm him before the execution. When he told me he's claustrophobic, and they offered to give him a shot of sedative to calm him down before they put him in the chair, and he just didn't want to panic, Kardashian wrote, I literally lost it. Throughout the afternoon and early evening, courts issued their decisions. The district court denied Bernard's motion to stay the execution. The 7th Circuit Court of Appeals denied an emergency motion. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals also denied relief. Each court found that procedural barriers prevented them from addressing the substantive claims. At 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, with the execution delayed but still proceeding, the Supreme Court issued its final ruling. In an unsigned order, the court denied Bernard's petitions. 3 justices dissented publicly: Sonia Sotomayor, Stephen Breyer, and Elena Kagan. Sotomayor's dissent was scathing. She detailed the Brady violation, the false testimony about gang hierarchy, and the jurors' post-trial statements. She explained how procedural barriers had prevented Bernard from ever getting a hearing on the merits of his constitutional claims. The government had successfully hidden exculpatory evidence until it was too late for the courts to consider it. President Trump was Brandon Bernard's last hope for clemency. The day before the execution, Alan Dershowitz allegedly spoke with Trump personally, asking him to commute Bernard's sentence. According to later reports, Trump apologized, but said he had already promised the Bagley family that Bernard would be executed. In the final hours, Bernard had conversations with his supporters and spiritual advisors. Jennifer Wasserstein, an immigration lawyer who had become his pen pal, spoke with him about what he would visualize on the gurney to stay calm. She told him to imagine her arms holding him down instead of straps. He promised he would. She told him she was sorry she couldn't save him. He said she had saved him with her love. Bernard's family had visited weeks earlier for their final goodbye. His mother Thelma, his siblings, daughter Kiara, and Aunt Rasha Williams had made the trip to Terre Haute. They spoke through the air hole in the glass barrier, unable to touch but able to share their love. Rasha Williams later said she had gone ready to encourage Brandon, but he had uplifted them instead. He's at peace and he has accepted what has happened, but he is hopeful, she reported. As 9 p.m. approached, Brandon Bernard was led into the death chamber at the Federal Correctional Center in Terre Haute, Indiana. Witnesses assembled behind glass barriers, including members of the Bagley family, Bernard's legal team, and media representatives. Bernard's last meal had consisted of a meat lover's pizza and a brownie, simple comfort foods. Now, as he lay on the gurney with witnesses watching, he lifted his head and turned toward the windows where the Bagley family sat. He spoke for more than 3 minutes, his final words directed at the family of the people he had helped kill 21 years earlier. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wish I could take it all back, but I can't." That's the only words that I can say that completely capture how I feel now and how I felt that day. The pool reporter present in the witness room observed Brandon Bernard closely during his final moments. Bernard showed no obvious signs of fear or distress, the reporter noted. He appeared calm and at peace, his voice steady as he spoke his final words. He also addressed the prison guards, telling them not to let his execution upset them, showing consideration for others, even at the moment of his own death. The execution team administered a lethal injection of phenobarbital, a barbiturate that depresses the central nervous system. Bernard's eyes closed soon after the injections began. His breathing became shallow and then stopped. Unlike some others who had been executed in that same chamber, Bernard did not twitch or heave. The process appeared peaceful. At 9:27 p.m. Eastern Time, Brandon Bernard was pronounced dead. He was 40 years old. He had spent more than 20 years on death row, longer than he had lived as a free person. He became the 9th federal prisoner executed in 2020 and the first person executed during a presidential transition period in 130 years. Within 30 minutes of the execution, Georgia Bagley, Todd's mother, spoke to reporters. She became emotional when discussing the apologies she had heard from both Villalva and Bernard. The apology and remorse helped very much heal my heart, she said, tears streaming down her face. I can very much say, I forgive them. Her statement reflected the Christian faith that had defined her son's life and sustained her through 2 decades of grief. Charles Woodard, representing the Bagley family, issued a written statement. I pray that Brandon has accepted Christ as his Savior, he wrote, because if he has, Todd and Stacie will welcome him into heaven with love and forgiveness. The family had consistently supported the death penalty for those who killed their loved ones, but they also maintained their commitment to Christian principles of redemption. Attorney Robert Owen released a statement on behalf of Bernard's legal team. Brandon's execution is a stain on America's criminal justice system, he wrote. But I pray that even in his death, Brandon will advance his commitment to helping others by moving us closer to a time when this country does not pointlessly and maliciously kill young black men who pose no threat to anyone, when we hold prosecutors to the highest standards of integrity in every case, and when our leaders exercise their moral authority where it is needed. We were proud to call Brandon our client and our friend, and we will miss him greatly. Kim Kardashian tweeted her reaction shortly after learning of Bernard's death. I'm so messed up right now, she wrote. They killed Brandon. He was such a reformed person, so hopeful and positive until the end. More importantly, he is sorry, so sorry for the hurt and pain he has caused others. In a follow-up tweet, she added, I could go on and on about what an amazing person Brandon was. I do know he left this earth feeling supported and loved and at peace. The execution drew immediate criticism from death penalty opponents and civil rights organizations. They pointed to the procedural barriers that had prevented Bernard from getting a hearing on his Brady claim, the racial composition of his jury, the inadequate defense representation, and the unprecedented nature of lame duck executions during a pandemic. Supporters of the death penalty, including some conservative commentators, defended the execution. Senator Ted Cruz criticized those who sided with the murderer rather than remembering the victims. The Bagley family has a right to see justice done, he argued, and that justice required Bernard to pay with his life for his crimes. The next day, December 11, 2020, the federal government executed Alfred Bourgeois for the murder of his 2-year-old daughter. The executions continued through January, with Lisa Montgomery becoming the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. In total, 13 federal prisoners were executed between July 2020 and January 2021, more than in the previous 56 years combined. The Brandon Bernard case reminds us that justice is not always served by finality, and that mercy has a place even in the face of terrible crimes. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, share it with others who care about criminal justice reform, and subscribe to support more documentaries that shine light on these critical issues. No Way Out, where every story matters and every voice deserves to be heard.